Hey, it's Jordan. Delighted to be joined by Kevin Gosztola with Shadowproof. And you have been doing real layman's work here, covering the Julian Assange extradition hearing that's been going on in the United Kingdom. You're up at 4 a.m. Covering this so that people like me could react to it. And essentially, from what I've seen, seems to be a show hearing, but you have the details. So can you kind of touch on, like, before we get into specifics, what's been the overall impression you've received from this hearing in terms of whether there's actually a fair process going on?
Yeah, no, I think that the defense has been given pretty good opportunity to present their witnesses. They have a good roster of people that have agreed to provide testimony. I think the number in total is close to 40 different individuals, and some people who are well known, like Noam Chomsky is expected to take the stand at some point. Daniel Ellsberg is going to come on day 7, which would be tomorrow. And then Patrick Coburn is a well-known Middle East correspondent who's expected to take the stand. There are some journalists who are known. There's some defense attorneys that are somewhat well-known as well, who've agreed to provide testimony. So they've put together a nice lineup of people, and Clive Stafford Smith was a witness last week who's with Reprieve and has done good work challenging the U.S. drone program. And so I think it's been, the court's allowed evidence related to U.S. war crimes and torture to be heard inside the courtroom without doing anything that would look like a shenanigan to stop it from being discussed. And so I think that even if we believe there's a foregone conclusion here, and we think that the judge is going to ultimately rule against Julian Assange, what we can say is that the judge is letting the defense put on its case for why Julian Assange should not be extradited.
Okay. And in terms of, because I've been following your thread, in terms of the arguments that what Assange did in relation to Chelsea Manning is no different than what other news organizations do every day. What has been the prosecution's argument that it's different, and how has the judge responded to both sides?
Well, the prosecutor's argument is that they're going to willfully misinterpret their own indictment and make it seem like they're not criminalizing journalism. And that took Trevor Timm, who is the executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, to take the stand in the first week and to say, yeah, 3 of your charges are only about specific documents that you say expose the names of informants and expose them to harm, but you actually have these other charges that are more general, and it goes to every single document. And in fact, you're actually criminalizing the receipt of the information. So basically, any journalist who received these documents would have been committing a crime just by possessing the classified information. So that's criminalizing news gathering and the most common practice of collecting information from sources. And so, the other thing is to say that to act like it's a crime to publish the name of informants and people who are human intelligence sources. It's not a crime in the United States. In fact, after the WikiLeaks publications in 2010, there was a feeble effort on the part of Joe Lieberman and some other senators to make it a crime through something called the SHIELD Act, and this was raised by Trevor Timm, but it never passed in Congress, so it's not a law. It wasn't a crime when WikiLeaks published the information, and it's still not a crime today when they're trying to prosecute Julian Assange. And so just so you were clear on how the extradition hearing unfolds, for the most part, the defense is the one that has to prove to the judge that Julian Assange should not be extradited, and then the prosecution gets almost unlimited leeway to challenge what the defense is doing through cross-examination of the witnesses. But it's, I think I watch these proceedings with the view that the judge is going to extradite Julian Assange unless the defense gives her reason to not do it.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I think is important, and I think the defense, I don't know if they're making the case, is if Assange supposedly gave Manning tips on a password or whatever, it wasn't to retrieve new information or to, retrieve new video or documents. It was to conceal her identity, which is a journalist's number one priority, to protect sources. So has that been argued by the defense, and what's been the reception to that?
Yeah, there was a journalism professor who took the stand last week. His name is Mark Feldstein, and he's actually the author of Poisoning the Press, which is a book about Richard Nixon and his war on the press. They had a very open war against a syndicated columnist named Jack Anderson back in the 1970s. So we heard some examples of the way he was targeted, but he was never formally prosecuted under the Espionage Act or any other law. And Mark Feldstein talked about how these are common news gathering practices to try to protect the privacy and to keep these sources anonymous. I think he would say that we're in this kind of squishy gray area when you're talking about Julian Assange potentially offering to help Chelsea Manning go through the U.S. computer system without being detected. I mean, first off, I'm not sure they fully proved through their evidence that that's something that Julian Assange ever did for Chelsea Manning. It certainly was talked about, but I haven't seen the evidence that he actually provided that assistance. And it also didn't come up during Chelsea Manning's court-martial when she was put on trial. I don't recall that coming from the military prosecutors. But even if it had, journalists are constantly doing things to try and deceive the U.S. government and potential FBI agents or police who might be interested, and they'll meet in garages and hand over documents covertly, or they'll find other ways in order to cloak so that those people can. And we have a very real example in the fact that the indictment now goes after Julian Assange for helping Edward Snowden to get out of Hong Kong and go to a third country, and then he was trapped in Moscow because his passport was revoked by the State Department. So we've heard about this, and one thing the defense has done that is very constructive to defending Julian Assange is to show that these actions are common news gathering practices. What the U.S. government is trying to stigmatize as criminal activity is actually something that journalists do all the time, regardless of their ideology, whether they are state-identified journalists who stand up for what the U.S. government does and print national security secrets to advance the U.S. foreign policy agenda, or whether you're anti-imperialist and you don't like what the U.S. government is doing, you would protect your sources and engage in these activities.
And I want to ask it a different way. The first question I asked was, is this a fair process? It seems from what you're saying, the judge is giving the defense a decent chance. But there's other things going on that make me think the deck is really stacked here. For example, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but they basically just threw additional charges and new indictments like 5 minutes before the hearing started. Not literally, but very soon before the hearing started. Secondly, Julian Assange's attorneys have said, we haven't been able to see our client in 6 months. Obviously, there's coronavirus, but there could have been some provisions made for them to meet in person. When we are able to talk, it's been difficult with the communication. The prison phone service isn't great. So essentially, it seems that Julian Assange is not getting the access to those attorneys that would represent a fair trial. And there's been other things. Amnesty International has been shut out from observing. I think a couple other organizations that normally would have access to observing haven't. So those things raise red flags to me that the deck is being stacked here.
Yeah, what you're describing are abuse or violations, alleged violations of his due process rights, as well as in the UK they call it open justice. And I know because before the proceedings started, I actually, through a lawyer in the UK, applied for remote video access because I was concerned that the court wasn't going to do enough to allow access for journalists, especially during this pandemic. I mean, I chose not to travel. I just don't, as a preference, I don't want to go travel in a global pandemic to the UK. I wasn't comfortable with doing that. And so there's been several dozen, at least a few dozen journalists that have been granted access through this video platform. And then what you're raising with Amnesty International and some of these other groups is there were 40 observers who had their access revoked by the judge, who were told they were going to be able to follow this, and then abruptly had that taken away. And the judge didn't really give that good of a reason. I think she kind of claimed that some of the European countries are doing okay with COVID, and then they could come to the courthouse if they wanted to. But it was really unfair because there was no ability to plan and ensure that they were there on that first day. They didn't get any notice that this was going to happen to them. And she basically blamed the court. She threw the people who are working there every day, hard workers, she threw them under the bus and made it seem like it was their fault that this happened. And then what you're talking about with the indictment, we're on our third indictment now, and that latest indictment came just about 6 weeks before this hearing. And the defense has had no opportunity, as they claim, to prepare for that part of the case that has been expanded. The storyline around Julian Assange and what he's accused of became much larger than what we know and what I know. I mean, I've always talked about this as a case involving Chelsea Manning providing documents to WikiLeaks. They were published, and he's being targeted for publishing that information by the U.S. government. And they're now going after him for allegedly recruiting systems administrators like Edward Snowden. They're saying he might have aided in hacking attempts by LulzSec in order to steal and purloin classified information. And this isn't anything that any government official gave appropriate notice to the defense that they would have to prepare to deal with in their case. And the judge doesn't seem to care because, in her view, she gave the defense an opportunity in August to ask for an adjournment to postpone what we are doing now until January. They did not take her up on that offer. Instead, they tried to get all of this conduct removed from the indictment, to say that it was unfairly inserted into the indictment. It should not be part of the case, this extradition case. Because we have a treaty. We have a treaty between the U.S. and the UK, and there's supposed to be a procedure that's followed. After a certain date, you don't add in more allegations to an extradition request. And she said no, she wasn't going to use her authority. She didn't feel like it was something she should have to do. And so when the defense turned around and asked Julian Assange, who we really need to be concerned about because it's going to impact him the most, would you be okay with being in jail for another 3 to 4 months before we have this hearing, before we might get closer to finding a decision from the judge? What would you like to do? And Julian Assange told his lawyers, go seek an adjournment. I want to have the best defense case possible. And in fact, the judge said, too bad, you're screwed. You didn't ask for an adjournment when I told you to, and we're going to proceed with this hearing.
Yeah. And in terms of law, I mean, technically on international law, he was never supposed to be dragged out of that embassy too in the United Kingdom. So it doesn't really seem like the UK is following their laws to the letter of the law. So with Daniel Ellsberg coming up, I would think an argument can be made, I don't know if the defense is going to argue this, that what is the difference between Julian Assange supposedly, again, I agree with you, when I read the original indictment, they provide zero proof that he tried to help Chelsea Manning get a password. But what is the difference between that, even if that were true, and the Washington Post working with Daniel Ellsberg? You think the Washington Post just sat idly and was just like, yes, we'll just wait for you to give us the information? There's coaxing that goes on, manipulation, urging. They might have not broken in themselves, but they, journalists work with sources all the time. What is the difference here? Do you expect that kind of argument?
Yeah, no, I think that what Daniel Ellsberg is going to be useful for the defense is showing the escalation in going after Julian Assange. Although, his case is even more relevant than people would believe, because it's not just important for him to testify because he can speak to how Espionage Act cases are pursued, and because he's sort of like that first test case that we all know about. He's been this figure that comes out in support of Chelsea Manning, who's come out in support of Edward Snowden, who stood up for a lot of these people who have been whistleblowers that were prosecuted under President Barack Obama. But he's important as well because his psychiatrist's office was broken into and burglarized by people who were told by Nixon to go get dirt on him that could be useful during his trial. And that ended up meaning that he survived and was never sentenced to prison. and was never actually convicted of violating classified information with the Pentagon Papers. And in this case, we have an example of this because UC Global, that is a Spanish private security company, targeted Julian Assange and his attorneys and any visitors and journalists that came to the Ecuador embassy. They systematically violated his privacy. There's actually a case unfolding in Spain around all of this. But they did things that were wild and crazy, like trying to get diapers from his children so that they could prove that he was the father. There's all kinds of stuff that they were trying to do against Julian Assange, and they were plotting to kidnap him from the embassy and possibly even poison Julian Assange. And this kind of conduct, and then the fact that they've also seized his confidential papers and manuscripts that he was writing and all this material that should be his private property that the government was able to get into their possession. I think that's something that Daniel Ellsberg is going to be able to talk about during his testimony.
And lastly, just want to get your thoughts on this. It seems to me there is a real hypocrisy, possibly selective amnesia among the corporate journalists who previously thought Julian Assange was a hero when he was exposing the Bush administration. Now, aside from very few instances, I barely see any journalists, whether it be the Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, we could go down the list, saying anything about this. Aside from the original indictment, I haven't seen any of them really talking against what's going on right now, the extradition hearing. And you also look at other things. For example, when Chelsea Manning was held in solitary confinement and tortured, same people were crickets, but now Reality Winner, who I don't think should be in jail, but putting that aside, they're all coming out, the grave injustice that's been done against her because her story was about Russia and Trump, or her leak was about Russia and Trump. So they are aghast that she's in prison, but they were silent on Chelsea Manning. My point is, it seems like there is journalistic outrage when the leak or whistleblower helps the neoliberal narrative, but when it doesn't, they're crickets. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, but even with Reality Winner, I would push back just slightly because I covered her case and I went down to Augusta to report on her sentencing hearing, and I've cared about her while she's been under the threat of COVID-19 in prison. And Rachel Maddow doesn't care about Reality Winner. I mean, she hasn't really dug into this case, and to the extent that it fuels the Russiagate narrative that she supports, she hasn't really seized upon it because the fact is that these personalities on MSNBC and CNN think that U.S. classified information is something sacrosanct that is not to be violated in any way. So even if it somehow helps them push their agenda, they would rather get it from an anonymous government official who whispers it in their ear, who isn't really taking any risk at all and isn't in some high-ranking position where they can do this without facing any threat whatsoever. People like Leon Panetta, who revealed the identity of someone in SEAL Team 6 when talking about the raid on Osama bin Laden. You just have people who will reveal the Stuxnet operation to take down Iran's nuclear infrastructure. That was a military general who ended up eventually getting pardoned by Barack Obama at the same time that Chelsea Manning had her sentence commuted. So they'd rather just, they'd rather these people just talk to them privately and not be out here publicly. And once they get entangled with prosecutors, they're hands off and they keep things distant and they don't dig into what the government is doing in their war on whistleblowers. And with Julian Assange, what you're saying is important because it has changed. And they would have us believe that we didn't learn anything of value, of importance, that it's not journalism to publish the Podesta emails from the Clinton campaign, and they would have us believe that what Julian Assange was doing was in service to Russia or a foreign power. And in fact, I would very strongly push back on this idea that Julian Assange has some duty to fit into U.S. politics. He's an Australian citizen. He can make whatever choice he wants about who he wants to support in the United States. And he also doesn't have to abide by our secrecy laws or our secrecy regulations. And that's the biggest thing here, is that this government with the Justice Department is pursuing a case and insisting that a foreigner, someone who is not a U.S. citizen, who never signed a non-disclosure agreement, protect U.S. classified information and not publish it. And that is a very dangerous thing that they are pushing, that is going to open a Pandora's box of allowing governments around the world, or giving permission to more powerful governments around the world to target journalists simply because they got their hands on classified documents. I could see Saudi Arabia, I could see Israel, I could see China or Russia, I could see Turkey, I could see so many different governments that might have power, maybe even Brazil, going after people simply because they go, oh, the U.S. did it, let's give this a try.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kevin. We'll keep following your updates and reporting on this case. Where can people find your work?
Yeah, so I'm doing live updates every morning, and like you said when we started the interview, when you wake up, I'm mostly done with the court day, so you'll get a whole thread of what happened every day at K. Gosztola, and then all the reports are being published at shadowproof.com. So thank you.
Thanks, Kevin Gosztola. We'll be in touch. Thanks, man.
All right.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com, where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.